In 1903, a stranger strolled into the small farming town of Corvallis, Oregon, with a bold declaration. He had a direct line to God. This claim, along with the man's charm and fierce knowledge of Scripture, was enough to eventually lure some of the townspeople away from their church and families. What followed was a rapid shift from fanatical religious movement into a full-blown, very bizarre cult. The once mundane little town was now in a constant state of chaos because of this cult, and rumors of affairs, orgies, and strange rituals swirled throughout the community. Eventually, the situation came to a head and multiple people lost their lives. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Summer Sanchez, and on this channel we talk about crime, cults, and heinous history. Today we are talking about a cult that was active at the turn of the 20th century. So we are talking like over 120 years ago. This cult was started by this man, Franz Edmund Crefield, and this guy was strange to say the least. The group went by a couple of names. They've been called the Holy Rollers and the Brides of Christ Church. And after doing all of the research for this case, I can't believe that more people have not talked about this. It is wild. There's a lot of moving parts to this one, and just when you think it's over, something absolutely crazy happens. So that is what we are talking about today, but before we get into the story, let's go ahead and briefly talk about today's sponsor. This video is sponsored by Manacora Honey. Manacora Honey is a single origin, rich and creamy honey that is chock full of antioxidants and prebiotics. It supports immunity, digestion, it gives you an energy boost, and it can even help to balance inflammation. Manacora Honey contains a natural antibacterial compound called MgO, which is only found in Manuka honey. It's ethically produced by master beekeepers in the remote forest of New Zealand. The bees go and collect the nectar from New Zealand's Manuka tea tree, and that nectar is totally packed full of bioactives. So the honey that's produced ends up having 3 times more antioxidants and prebiotics than your average everyday honey. My typical midday snack is Greek yogurt with fruit and granola, and I've started adding the honey on top, and I love it so much. It's delicious. I also use this in hot herbal tea. It adds like a rich caramel flavor, and all you need is about 1 to 3 teaspoons per day to get all of the benefits, but you can eat more throughout the day if you want. And they also have these really convenient little travel packs of honey that you can take with you on the go for an energy boost. The perfect little pick-me-up if you're running errands, or maybe you just need like a boost before you go to the gym. This honey tastes great. It has an amazing texture. Just look how smooth it is. And it also has a ton of health benefits. This is a super easy way to add so many amazing health benefits to your daily routine. And you can head over to manacora.com/summer to get $25 off the starter kit. The starter kit comes with an MgO 850 plus Manuka honey jar, 5 honey travel sticks, a wooden spoon, and a guidebook. So that's manukora.com/summer to get $25 off your starter kit. Thanks again to Manacora Honey for sponsoring this video, and now let's get into the case. This man's name is Franz Edmund Crefield. Now, we know next to nothing about this Crefield guy leading up to the events of this case. It's believed that he was originally from Germany, and he was likely born sometime in the 1870s. And just based on what he goes on to do, it's thought that he likely came from a very religious background. Maybe he studied theology, we just don't know. But at some point, likely when he was in his 20s, Crefield arrived in the United States. And we also know that by 1899, Crefield was a member of the Salvation Army in the state of Oregon. For those who might not be familiar with the Salvation Army, it's a Christian organization that does a lot of charity and evangelical work. They have rankings like the military has, so they have lieutenants, captains, majors. I'm sure most of you have seen the Salvation Army people around the holidays ringing their bells in front of the grocery stores asking for donations. And Crefield was extremely religious, and he thought that the Salvation Army would be a great place for him. And so he joins the Salvation Army, and things did go well at first. Crefield was even chosen to go to an officer training school because the higher-ups thought that he might have a future as a leader. But at some point, he started to have this shift, and people were starting to notice a change in Crefield. Now, I don't know what kicked off this change, but after about a year or so in the Salvation Army, he started to become even more fanatical in his religious beliefs. And eventually, he started butting heads with others in the group because he believed that they were putting too much emphasis on money. They were too caught up with constantly trying to collect money for charity, and he felt that money wasn't that important. And so he starts having falling outs with the other members of the Salvation Army. And then in 1901, Crefield was allegedly visited by the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit told him that he should leave the Salvation Army because the members were not entirely of God. So he left the Salvation Army and he traveled to the town of Salem, Oregon, where he met a man named Martin L. Ryan. Martin L. Ryan was a Pentecostal preacher, and he ran a training school for aspiring preachers. Crefield enrolled in the school, and he actually really clicked with Martin L. Ryan's teachings. And once again, everything is going just fine, and then the Holy Spirit shows up again with another message. This time, Crefield claimed that the Holy Spirit told him that he was God's chosen one. He was special. And so from that point on, Crefield started to have kind of like a chip on his shoulder, and he's starting to feel like he doesn't really need Martin Ryan's guidance any longer, and he's ready to set out on his own and start his own church. And he would be the prophet of this church. So in 1903, he left Salem and he traveled about 40 miles south until he arrived in the small town of Corvallis. Now, like I said in the intro, at this time in 1903, Corvallis was just a small farming community. Corvallis was the epitome of a town where everyone knows everyone. Everyone knew everyone else's business. There were no secrets. If someone was sick, the entire town knew about it. If someone traveled out of town, everyone knew about it. In fact, in the book that I read on this case, the author includes quotes from local newspaper articles during this time. And some of the news that they reported on was just like mundane things happening in the lives of the townspeople. Like in this article from October 26, 1901, this was about a man who went for a bike ride. A swift journey on a bicycle was made Saturday by Frank Hurt. He went from Corvallis to Oregon City in 6 hours. It's not likely that the trip was ever made by Will in so short a time. But this one is my favorite. This one was printed in the paper on May 29th, 1901. It happened in Klein's store Saturday evening. The employees were boxing eggs for shipment. Victor Hurt stooped over an egg case and rummaged in the bottom when a big rat ran up his arm on his shoulder, brandishing his tail in his face. Hurt, convinced that it was the panther reported at large west of town, fell over himself in terror and set up a commotion that brought all employees to the scene. So you get it. This is a small town. Life is pretty boring. Not much excitement going on in Corvallis during this time. That was until Edmund Crefield suddenly showed up in town. Now, he didn't just walk into town and announce that he was God's chosen one right away. If he just showed up and started spouting off about visions from God and prophets and stuff like that, he knew people would just think he was crazy and he would be labeled a religious fanatic. He had to ease people into it. So he started out preaching about the usual stuff, being a good person, helping out your neighbor. They would sing hymns and stuff, really just like the normal thing that you hear at any other church. And this was how he started to gain a small following. And once he'd gained their trust, he started to mention how God had spoken to him. And he promised his followers that if they just gave themselves to God fully, he would speak to them one day as well. Not only that, but they would also get their names written on a holy roll in heaven. But he said there was limited space on the holy roll, and so they needed to decide if they were fully committed to his teachings or not. And whoever didn't have their names on that holy roll would be condemned to hell. Now, not everyone was buying what Crefield was saying, and some people left. They just got up and left. But there were quite a few who did buy into this, and these people are the ones who became Crefield's most loyal followers. Many of these people just happened to be members of the Salvation Army who ended up leaving the Salvation Army to join Crefield's new church. Now that Crefield had his core group, he started to introduce more strange things into their meetings. He talked a lot about hell and repentance, and he also started putting a lot of emphasis on how their group was far superior to other religious groups because they were being led by someone with a direct link to God. Crefield was supposedly a prophet, and so he and his group were being led by God directly, and so they were just by default better. He also said that he had healing powers, and so he would have them sit down, he would start praying over them, he would wave his hands over their heads, and then they would supposedly be healed of all their issues. Repenting was a major part of this group's belief system. Crefield would have them pray over each other for hours and hours. They would all start convulsing and screaming. They would chant prayers. And then Crefield started having them roll around on the ground and scream prayers for hours. Some of these sessions would go on for up to 24 hours, an entire day of rolling around on the ground and screaming. And then once they finally stopped, they were so mentally drained and their vision was all blurry and they would feel disoriented from the lack of sleep and the exhaustion from physically rolling around for hours that they would convince themselves that they were hearing messages from God. And they believed that what Crefield had promised them, that they would also be able to receive messages from God like he did, they would think that that must be true. He must have been telling them the truth because he must actually be a prophet. And he had given them the secret formula to becoming closer to God, which for most people back in this time, it was like their ultimate life goal. Now, what likely was happening is that they were having shared religious delusions and they were hallucinating. They were delirious from the lack of sleep and exhaustion from the praying, rolling, screaming, repenting. Someone probably started hallucinating and seeing and hearing God, and then they all just kind of started feeding off of each other. But either way, these people were completely hooked after this first communication from God, and they totally devoted themselves to Crefield. But as you can imagine, these meetings were very, very loud and chaotic. And I'm not really sure where Crefield was conducting these meetings, if he had a building like a church or a house, or if they were meeting outside somewhere in town. But the other townspeople, the non-believers, they started to get really angry. The sessions would last all night long sometimes, and they would be trying to sleep, and they could hear screaming and chanting from Crefield's people all night long. Not only that, but many of Crefield's followers were women, and they were not acting in a way that was expected of a woman back then. All of that rolling around on the ground caused their hair to come down from its usual bun. They were walking around barefoot, which was also apparently scandalous. And so the townspeople started talking to each other more and more about this weird group. They'd see each other out and about during the day, and they'd stop and they'd start, just ranting to each other about what was going on. Words like sect and cult were starting to be thrown around, and the townspeople started referring to the group as the Holy Rollers because they would be rolling around on the ground all the time. This is probably also a nod to the Holy Roll that they supposedly had their names written on. And after a while, the community had just had enough, and it was decided that Crefield would be banned from holding services within Corvallis city limits. I think that the townspeople were hoping that this would squash the whole thing, like Crefield would just leave and his followers would go back to their normal lives, and that would be the end of that. But that is definitely not what happened. His followers did not abandon him. They were completely hooked in by this point. The situation just gets so much worse, and things start to go completely off the rails from this point. So the city officials go to Crefield and they let him know that he is now banned from holding services in Corvallis. But that's okay because it just so happened that God had visited Crefield and told him to move his flock to a place called Smith Island. Now, I cannot find this island on a map. I see John Smith Island not far from Corvallis. I'm not really sure if that's the same thing, but in the research, Smith Island is described as a small uninhabited island 3 miles outside of Corvallis. And in the summer of 1903, this is where Crefield and his followers went to live. These people just up and left their jobs, their families, their spouses in some cases. Most of Crefield's followers were women, and some of these women were married. They had children, and they just walked away from it all to be with Crefield. Now, Crefield was described as not such an attractive person. He was described as very homely in the newspapers, but he was extremely charismatic. He was very charming. There were about 20 people that followed Crefield to Smith Island during the summer of 1903. And before we go any further into the story, I want to talk about some of the main characters because some of them play major roles in what goes on to happen. I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible because it's going to start to get confusing. There are a lot of people involved in this case. So first we have the Hurt family, O.V. Hurt and his wife Sarah Hurt, and then their 5 kids, Maud, Frank, May, Roy, and Martha. 23-year-old Maud was described as very pretty and extremely intelligent. When she was only 8 years old, she was described as a child prodigy when it came to religion. And then when she was 14, she joined the Salvation Army because she thought that this would be the easiest way for her to spread the word of God and help those in need. And when Crefield strolled into town earlier that year and he started talking about how there was limited space on the Holy Roll, Maud became one of Crefield's most loyal followers. And she decided to go with him to Smith Island that summer. But before she left, she convinced some of her family members to go with her because she was afraid that her loved ones would burn in hell if they didn't get their names on that holy roll. Her father, O.V. Hurt, decided not to go to Smith Island, but his wife Sarah did go. Also, Maud's sister May and her brother Frank, they also went. Frank Hurt was engaged to a woman named Molly Sandell, and she also went to the island that summer. Then there is Burgess Starr, and Burgess was married into the Mitchell family. Now, the Mitchell family consisted of David, Phoebe, Fred, Donna, George, Perry, and Esther. They were all siblings. but Donna and Esther were the only two followers of Crefield's in this family. The rest of the siblings were not in the cult. And these kids had a pretty rough childhood. Their mother died when they were very young from typhoid. And after their mother died, their father Charles joined the Salvation Army. He moved off to Illinois, started a life with another woman, and abandoned all 7 of his children in Oregon, leaving them to fend for themselves. Donna Mitchell was about 23 years old at this point, and she was married to Burgess Starr. And Esther Mitchell was 15. She had been a member of the Salvation Army, but she had quit to follow Crefield to Smith Island. 35-year-old Samson Levins was another follower and one of the only men in the group. Samson was a veteran of the Spanish-American War, and he had been searching for religious fulfillment, but he was coming up empty with the more mainstream religions. So when Crefield showed up talking about all of these new ideas and the potential to literally receive messages from God, he completely threw himself into this cult. Lee Campbell and his fiancée Sophie Hartley, they were also on the island that summer. Sophie came from a very wealthy family, and she was currently a student at Oregon Agricultural College. Her mother, Cora Hartley, also joined Crefield's cult, completely against her husband's wishes. Her husband was Lewis Hartley, and he was by far the richest man in the area. He had his own mining company, and he was estimated to be worth $1.2 million. And Lewis didn't like Crefield at all, and he really didn't like that his daughter and his wife were following this guy to Smith Island. This Holy Roller movement really shook up this community. The front pages of the papers were no longer filled with boring articles. They were now constantly filled with articles about Crefield's cult. And the men in town started to think that Crefield was a hypnotist. That's the only idea that they could come up with to explain why these normal, respectable members of society were suddenly acting so bizarre. Now, once they arrived on Smith Island, they set up their camp, they built tents and fires, and now they had all the privacy they needed to just roll around and scream for forgiveness. Crefield's talk of the apocalypse really ramped up at this point, and he was telling his followers that seals and revelations would be broken and plagues would consume the earth, which would bring on the restoration of the world. And this new world would be the same as the Garden of Eden, and everything would be just like it had been in the very beginning with Adam and Eve. He also proclaimed himself to now be called Joshua, the holy prophet, and later he would change his name again to Elijah once the restoration started taking place. I'm just going to keep referring to him as Crefield throughout this video because it's going to start to get confusing, but all of his followers are calling him Joshua. He had everyone get rid of their nice clothes, and they were forced to wear really thin dresses, or sometimes they were told not to wear anything at all, because he told them they should get rid of their worldly possessions. Or at least that's what he claimed the reason was. You will see later that Crefield was just a creep. And pretty much the entire time they were on this island, everyone was in a religious frenzy. They were having these 24-hour roll-a-thons multiple days per week. They were in a constant state of prayer and exhaustion. And the longer they stayed in this frenzied state, the more convinced they were that they were right where God wanted them to be. They were becoming more and more delusional by the day. And it was here on Smith Island that things really started to take a dark turn. Because as you probably guessed, Edmund Crefield did not have good intentions here. And this is when he started letting his true colors show. So first of all, remember Maud Hurt. She's the 23-year-old child prodigy daughter of O.V. Hurt. Well, Maud was engaged to a man named James Barry. James was kind of a follower of Crefield, but he wasn't really as into it as Maud was. Well, James was extremely wealthy. He owned several businesses. In fact, it was James Barry who gave Crefield the seed money to start up his church when he first arrived in Corvallis. Now, when the cult moved to Smith Island, James did not go because he was super busy running all of his businesses, but he would travel there often for visits. During one of these visits, Crefield informed James that the group was going to get their very own tabernacle, which is essentially just like a place of worship. And James was like, well, that's cool. Who's paying for this tabernacle? Because he knew that Crefield did not have any money. And Crefield said, you are. God told me that you will be paying for us to have a place of worship, and you better do it or God will smite you. But like I said, James was not as devoted to Crefield, and so he refused to pay. And not only that, he asked Crefield when he was planning to pay him back for that first loan. And Crefield then informed him that God had canceled that debt and he didn't owe him anything. And he told James that he expected him to write up a receipt showing that the debt had been canceled. So of course, James was pissed and he ended up leaving the island. And Crefield is now also infuriated because how dare James disobey God's orders? But more importantly, how dare James cut off his money supply? So he sets out on this smear campaign. He starts telling his followers all these terrible things about James, and he ordered Maud Hurt to break off their engagement. And without even a second thought, she broke up with James. And I don't know what snapped in Crefield's mind after this, but he started splitting up all the couples in the group, all the unmarried couples. So like Lee Campbell and Sophie Hartley, they split up. Frank Hurt and Molly Sandell, they would have also been split up, but they had already gotten married. Basically, any couple who had just been dating or who were engaged, they were now effectively not together anymore. And then he started implementing these really creepy ceremonies that he referred to as being endowed with the grace of love. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. Crefield would have each of the women come into his tent alone, and they would remain in the tent praying together for hours. At least that's what they claimed they were doing. It's not known exactly what happened in the tent during those ceremonies, but just based on what Crefield goes on to do later, it's safe to assume that he was manipulating the women into performing sex acts on him. Then, at the end of this little ceremony, Crefield would order the women to wrap their arms around his neck and kiss him. It didn't matter if the woman was married or not. Every one of them had to do this. And I keep saying women, but actually some of them are still children. They are not yet considered adults. And Crefield would perform this ceremony with all of them, no matter what age. And if anyone refused, he would say that they were possessed, and then he would beat the devil out of them. And these beatings were brutal. One guy named Ed Sharp was literally chased into the woods and beaten by Crefield and another member. He ended up leaving the cult, and when he showed back up in Corvallis, he was all bruised up and he had 2 black eyes. And sometimes Crefield would drag people into a private tent and he would beat them in there. So because of all of the creepy tent meetings with the women and now the beatings, some of the men in the cult actually did start to have some doubts. And as soon as Crefield even had an inkling that the men were having doubts, he started kicking them out. He could not risk having these men secretly talking sense into the other members. And so he ended up kicking out all of the men in the group except for 3: Frank Hurt, Lee Campbell, and Samson Levins. Some of the men who were kicked out, their wives were still in the cult, and the wives were instructed to shun their husbands. That is how strong of a hold he had over these people. They were willing to walk away from their marriages for Crefield. Burgess Starr, who was among the men who had been kicked out, he told reporters when he placed his hands on their heads, they were absolutely in his power and did anything he told them. He abused them and called them names, but they never resented it. And had he told them to jump in the river, they would not have hesitated a moment, but plunged in. And now we introduce another character into the story, a man named Charles Brooks. Charles Brooks had been a member of the Salvation Army for 11 years. He was extremely devoted, and he had managed to climb the ranks to captain. And when word started to spread around Oregon about the weird things that were happening on Smith Island with this strange religious group, the Salvation Army decided to step in and see what was going on. And so they sent Captain Charles Brooks to go check things out. So Brooks arrives on Smith Island and he starts, asking questions. And it didn't take long for Brooks to fall under Crefield's spell as well. This high-ranking, super dedicated Salvation Army captain decided to abandon his mission and join Crefield's cult. Not only that, but he became Crefield's right-hand man. He was essentially second in command. Okay, so now Crefield has dwindled his flock down to the most loyal people, and he has about 20 followers, 4 men and 16 women. This is a photo of the cult when they were on Smith Island. And you can see Crefield here. He is surrounded by women. He is just loving life. But now they have a problem because the summer is coming to an end and it's going to start getting cold soon. And they knew they couldn't stay on the island in those little tents for much longer. And they didn't have their tabernacle because James Barry had cut off their funding. They can't go back to Corvallis because they were still banned. So now they had to figure out where they were going to go. And that's when super devoted, loyal Maud Hurt steps up and she says, look, my family technically lives right outside of Corvallis city limits. We can all go to my parents' house and we can set up there until we figure things out. Now, if you remember, Maud's mother, Sarah, did go to the island with her and a couple of her siblings as well. But her father, O.V. Hurt, stayed back at their house. And all summer long, he was waiting for his wife and children to return home from the island. And when they finally did return, they brought with them Crefield and his entire flock. But O.V. Hurt was such a devoted husband and father. He really, really loved his family, and he was just happy to to have them back. And even though he didn't buy into Crefield's BS, he did tolerate him being there because it meant that his family would also be there. It's actually really sad, especially because they treated OV so horribly because he was not a follower. They disrespected him constantly in his own house. They did not call him by his name. They all referred to him as a black devil, and they would constantly tell him that God was going to smite him. Even his own wife and kids would say this stuff to him. His wife Sarah didn't even want him to touch her. And OV just took this abuse because he didn't want to lose his family again. So as word started to spread that Crefield's cult had left the island and they were now residing at the Hurt house, family members of some of the followers started to show up, and they started trying to talk some sense into their loved ones who were still in the cult. But Crefield always intervened, and he would be right in their ears saying whatever he needed to say to keep them loyal. At this point, Crefield had control over literally every aspect of his followers' lives. He decided what they wore, which was sometimes nothing at all. He controlled what they ate. He had a rule that his followers were not allowed to eat or drink anything unless he touched it first. I guess he was like touching their food and sticking his hands in their drinks. And if he did not touch the food, it was off limits. For a while, the only food and drink that Crefield would touch was bread and water. And then eventually he stopped touching any food. And so they all went hungry. And he claimed that he did this because he wanted his followers to truly understand what it meant to go hungry. He would make every member of the group sleep on the floor in a room together every night with very little clothing on. He would not allow them to speak to anyone outside of their group without his permission because the outsiders were all considered to be evil. Crefield had completely melted their minds. And unfortunately, after being forced to be around the cult day in and day out, eventually OV Hurt also joined the group. I personally think that he only did this for his wife and kids. I don't think that he ever truly bought into any of it. Crefield ordered OV to quit his job, and he swapped out his nice clothes for the rags that the others were wearing, and now he was one of them. Now, twice a year, the people in this community would do a deep cleaning of their houses, and they would go outside to wash clothes and beat rugs and stuff like that. Well, on this particular yearly cleaning, instead of taking stuff outside to clean, Crefield ordered everything in OV Hurt's house to be taken outside and burned. He ordered his followers to start a giant bonfire and burn all of their possessions. Some of the followers even went all the way back to their own homes in Corvallis. They grabbed stuff to bring back to throw into the fire. They also sacrificed a dog during this burn party. There were also rumors that they had sacrificed a baby. The Hurt family had adopted a baby named Martha, and she was about 2 or 3 years old at this point, and word around town was that they had sacrificed her. Now, this ended up not being true, but at first the police did not know that, and of course they had to go investigate this rumor. And so a couple of police officers went down to the Hurt home, and they were let in by OV. He welcomed them in, and he allowed them to come in and see that Martha had not been sacrificed. She was alive and well. And these officers walked in on the creepiest scene. It sounds like something from like an A24 movie. All of the members of this cult were in a room together. Some of them were kneeling, some were lying down, some were squatting, some were rolling around on the floor, and they all appeared to be in a trance. The officers described the people as looking extremely pale and haggard with hollowed eyes. Some were laughing, some were crying, some were chanting, and in the middle of the room was a young girl with a piece of cloth over her head. Crefield was sitting next to this girl, and she was revealing a message that she was supposedly receiving from God, and some of the other members were writing down what she said. One of the officers did try to pull the cloth off of the girl's face so they could see who she was, but the cult members started screaming at them not to touch her, and so they backed off for some reason, and we actually still don't know who that girl was or how old she was for that matter. The officers knew that something really weird was going on here, and they knew that they needed to take Crefield in for something, and the only thing that they could think of was to take him and Brooks, because he was second in command, into custody. They would be given a psychiatric test because at this point everyone thought that they were losing their minds. However, they both ended up passing this test, and they were eventually released from custody. Now, some of the followers had shown up at the courthouse to show their support for Crefield and Brooks while they were still in custody. And when the families of some of the followers found out that they were going to be at the courthouse, they went down there and they literally kidnapped their loved ones. One of these members was Una Baldwin. Her father and a couple of other men grabbed her as she was walking out of the courthouse, and they carried her kicking and screaming to a wagon and took her back home. And now news of this cult is traveling outside of Oregon, and other states are starting to talk about it. Like, this is big news. And people were very angry, and they started showing up at the Hurt home to intimidate Crefield. People would throw stones at the house, they would bust out windows. But in response to this intimidation, Crefield just doubled down, and he started building his tabernacle at the Hurt home, probably on Ovi's dime. But something was about to happen that would cause the first real shakeup in the group. In November of 1903, James Barry, remember James, Maud's ex-fiance? Well, he somehow managed to speak to Ovi alone just for a minute, and he invited him on a trip to Portland, and Ovi accepted the invitation. Now, we don't know what was said, but by the end of that trip, Ovi had decided that it was time for Crefield to go. He wanted out of the cult, and he wanted Crefield and Brooks out of his house immediately. Now, the drawback to this was that most of Ovi's family was still in the cult, and they weren't showing any signs of leaving anytime soon. In fact, Frank Hurt ended up moving out of his dad's house, and he and his wife Molly got their own house right outside of Corvallis. And after Ovi kicked them out, this was Crefield's new headquarters. He and the remaining members moved into Frank and Molly's house, and they started building their tabernacle there. And around this time, Crefield had another revelation. He claimed God said he needed to find a woman who would be the next Virgin Mary and bear the second Christ. He told his followers that he could purify them, which would wash away their sins, and then they would be in the running to be the next Virgin Mary. Even if they already had children, since he was purifying them, their previous sexual encounters would no longer count. And this is actually how they got the name the Brides of Christ. And this is when Crefield started having sex with all of the women and even the underage girls in the cult, all of them believing that he was purifying them of their sins. He started conducting actual orgies in Frank and Molly's house. He was having sex with everyone, all in the same room. He's having sex with the mothers in front of the daughters in front of the mothers. He also instructed the women to have sex with some of the other men in the group. There were at least 3 underage girls who were being manipulated into participating in all of this. This was abuse. One of those girls was Esther Mitchell, who was 16 years old at the time, and she had actually become Crefield's first pick to be the new Virgin Mary. She was supposed to bear this second Christ and become Crefield's wife. But as soon as her older sister, who was not a member of the cult, as soon as she found out about it, she had Esther committed to a home for abused and orphaned children. Remember, Esther's mom had died and her dad abandoned them, and so she was kind of orphaned, and so her sister just wanted to put her up somewhere where Crefield could not get to her. So with Esther now out of the running, his next pick was Maud Hurt. But before he could marry Maud, a group of 20 angry men from town, calling themselves Whitecaps, went over to Frank Hurt's house in the middle of the night. They broke in and ordered all 4 male members of the cult to come with them. They loaded the 4 men onto a ferry, and when they arrived in Corvallis, they marched them through the center of town, and they forced the men to strip. And I had to include this part because I swear the reporting back then was so insane. Apparently, allegedly, once Crefield stripped down naked, someone measured his penis and it was 13 inches long. It's an odd detail to add to the story. And after they allegedly measured his penis, they proceeded to tar and feather them right there in the middle of town because they knew no one would do anything about it. Everyone hated Crefield and they knew no one was going to stop them. Crefield got it the worst. He got 2 coats of tar. Brooks got 1 coat, and then the other 2 men just had their heads tarred and feathered. And Frank Hurt was not there. He hadn't been home at the time, and so he had lucked out. Now, after they tarred and feathered the men, the Whitecaps warned them to stay out of Corvallis, or the next time they saw them, it would be much, much worse. And then they let them go. They managed to make their way back to Frank's house, and the very next day, Crefield and Maud got married. The people who were present for the ceremony said that they could still smell the tar on Crefield. And then right after they got married, Crefield moved to Portland. I guess he was starting to get a little worried about all of the threats, and he wanted to get out of town for a bit. And things actually settled down for a bit, and as more time passed, the townspeople started to feel hopeful that the nightmare was finally over and they could all just get back to normal. But then rumors started circulating that Crefield was planning to make a return to the area. And the community did not want that to happen. So Burgess Starr, who is married to Donna Mitchell, Esther's sister, sorry, I know it's getting confusing with all of these people, but Burgess Starr goes down to the police station and he says, my wife has just told me that when she was in the cult, Crefield slept with her and he had manipulated her into sleeping with him. The police couldn't just take Burgess Starr's word for this, and they needed Donna to actually tell them this for herself. And so she did actually end up going down to the station and she told them everything. Now, back in 1904, 1904, committing adultery was illegal. And this was actually great because it gave the police something that they could use to put Crefield behind bars. So a warrant was finally put out for Crefield's arrest. But the problem was they couldn't find him. They ended up searching for weeks with no luck. And while all of this is happening, the remaining cult members were still just as devoted as ever. They were still fasting for days at a time. They were still rolling around, praying constantly. They were walking around with their hair down and no hat, which was extremely scandalous apparently. And the families of the remaining members didn't know what to do. They had hoped that with Crefield being gone, that they would snap out of it, but that wasn't happening. So several of the families had their loved ones committed to the Oregon State Insane Asylum in Salem because they truly thought that they had gone mad. So one by one, the members were collected and committed. You can actually see some of their papers here from where they were sent to the hospital. Maud Hurt Crefield, committed May 3rd, 1904, religious fanatic, believes in not wearing any covering for the head, and a destruction of all the unnecessary articles of apparel. This one says Frank and Molly Hurt, committed April 30th, 1904, lie upon their faces upon the floor and pray day and night, claiming to receive messages directly from God, go upon the streets bareheaded, in the thinnest of raiment, destroy clothing and valuable and useful property belonging to themselves, injuring their mind and health by continuation of these practices, which they claim are the commands of God. O.V.'s wife, Sarah Hurt, was the last of the members to be committed to the hospital, and she was taken in on June 27th. And when they came to pick her up, she was kicking and screaming. She did not want to go. O.V. had a meeting with the doctors, and this is when some pretty alarming information came out. He told them that Sarah and Maud had refused to take care of the baby Martha that they had adopted because Crefield had convinced them that the baby was evil. They would not have anything to do with Martha. They wouldn't feed her. They wouldn't bathe her. Nothing. They did not mess with her. O.V. did everything for Martha while he was home. And when it was time for him to go to work, he had to take her to a neighbor's house because he knew that Sarah and Maud would not take care of her. And he told them that Crefield had actually suggested that they sacrifice Martha back when that rumor was going around. But I guess O.V. had stopped all of that from happening. I can't imagine what would have happened if O.V. had actually bought into everything that Crefield was saying. So now the members are locked away in the Oregon State Insane Asylum. But where is Crefield? He's still nowhere to be found, and a reward was offered to anyone who found him, and it had gone up to over $300, which was huge at that time. But still they heard nothing. And then on July 29th, about a month after Sarah was committed, Crefield was finally found, and no one could have guessed where he had been hiding. Roy Hurt, O.V., and Sarah's teenage son had been out in their yard collecting corks that day, and he decided to dig under the house to find some more corks. And as he was digging, he saw something out of the corner of his eye, but it was really dark and he couldn't really make it out. But then he heard a voice that he had heard multiple times before, and he knew immediately that that was the voice of Edmund Crefield. For the last 3 months that he had been missing, presumably on the run, Crefield had actually been hiding in a shallow hole under O.V. Hurt's house. Maud and Sarah had been sneaking down there and giving him food and clothing, but once they had both been taken into the hospital, he had no one to feed him. He was so emaciated that he could barely make his way out from under the house. But Roy actually demanded that Crefield come out, and then he went in and got his dad, O.V., and they could not believe the state that Crefield was in. They were in shock. First of all, he was completely naked, and his hair and beard were very grown out. He was so dirty. He was super skinny and emaciated. He looked wild. This is a photo of him right after he was taken into custody. And Crefield just kept telling everyone that his name was now Elijah. Remember, he said he'd become Elijah once the restoration was in progress. And once he got down to the jailhouse, he was examined by a psychiatrist, and it was determined that he was, quote, demented. But the case went to trial anyways, eventually, and during his trial, he refused a lawyer, and he said that God would be his lawyer. And it was during Crefield's trial that some of the sexual details came out. Details about how he had manipulated several married women and underage girls into having sex with him. In fact, it ended up coming out that while he was hiding under the house for those few months, he hadn't stopped abusing his followers. When O.V. would leave for work, Crefield would crawl out from under the house, and he and his followers would have orgies in O.V.'s house while he was gone. Crefield didn't call any witnesses, and in the end, he was found guilty and sentenced to 24 months in prison. This really should be the end of the story, but unfortunately, it's far from over because now we need to talk about the murders. On December 13th, 1905, Crefield was released from prison after serving only 17 months of his sentence, and now he was back out in society, free to do whatever he wanted to do. And what he wanted to do was get the old gang back together. By this point, his followers had been released from the psychiatric hospital, and so they were out and free to do whatever they wanted. So Crefield immediately moves to Seattle as soon as he's released. And he did this because he heard that that's where Frank and Molly Hurt were now living, and so he moved into their house, and that's where he kind of set up camp. And he immediately started writing letters to his followers. He's telling them that they were now in the restoration phase. He is now Elijah, and they needed to build their new Eden in a place called the 1900’s River. Maud Hurt was the first to join him in Seattle. Even after 17 months and a long stay at the psychiatric hospital, she was still completely brainwashed. And then after Maud arrived, the rest of the followers started to trickle in. Remember Esther Mitchell? She had been Crefield's first choice to be his wife, and her sister had her put into that orphanage. Well, she was no longer a minor. She was now 18, and she managed to find her way back to Crefield. Donna Starr, who had signed a statement against Crefield about the sexual abuse that was happening in the cult, she also went back, leaving behind her husband Burgess and their 3 very young kids, one of which was only 7 months old. The Hartleys came back as well, Cora and Sophie Hartley. The dad, Lewis, was enraged because he thought he had finally snapped his wife and daughter out of the trance that they had been in, but no, they just up and left again. But Lewis actually discovered Cora and Sophie's plan to join Crefield at 1900’s River before they left, and he knew the route to get to that location required a ride on a ferry, and so he hatched a plan. He was done with Crefield. He wanted this guy completely out of his family's lives. And so he went and bought a gun. He hid near where the people would be boarding the ferry, and he waited until he saw Crefield show up. And as Crefield and some of his followers were boarding the ferry, Lewis came out from his hiding place, and he pulls out a gun, and he fired a total of 5 times. However, the gun had malfunctioned and it didn't fire a single bullet. And all of this happened in front of his followers, and so Crefield capitalized on this moment. He told them, "See, no man can kill me. I'm God's chosen one. It was divine intervention." And unfortunately, this murder attempt ended up convincing the followers of Crefield's holy status even more. Lewis's wife and daughter, Cora and Sophie, they were there when all this went down, and they told Lewis that if he would have succeeded in killing Crefield, they would have killed him. So with everyone somehow even more deluded by Crefield, they all got on the ferry and they made their way to the 1900’s River. They set up camp, and Crefield's new rule was that there was no clothing allowed. They were all to live just like Adam and Eve. They burned most of their clothing in a fire, and they would be just like rolling around on the ground naked, dancing around the fire naked. They were chanting and screaming for hours and hours. It was just like the old days. Crefield was likely still abusing his followers as well. Now, this was a pretty isolated area, but there were people living across the river who very quickly got annoyed by Crefield and his people. And at this point, everyone knew who he was, and no one wanted the Holy Rollers in their community. So they were very quickly forced to leave that location, and after that, they kind of roamed around. They tried a few more spots, but the same thing just continued to happen. And so now they had a problem. They had very little clothing because they had burned most of it. They had very little food, and now they had no camp. And they were just kind of roaming around the Oregon coast aimlessly. So finally, after, roaming around for a while, Crefield says, "Look, Maud, you go to Seattle and you wait for me to send for you. I'm going to go scout around the coast alone and look for a spot for our new Eden. And the rest of you just stay here in this spot and wait for me." Now, this spot was actually a very remote area called Cummins Creek, and there was a cave near the creek. And so he instructed everyone to stay there in the cave and wait for him to return. He would come back as soon as he found a good spot for Eden, and he'd lead them all there. Keep in mind, again, they have very little provisions here. So he leaves his followers in the cave. Maud leaves. She makes her way to Seattle. And what Crefield did after he left that spot, I'm not really 100% sure. But not long after Maud made it back to Seattle, Crefield was there with her. He was seen in Seattle with Maud. It didn't seem like he was really searching for a new Eden either. He was spotted walking down the sidewalk fully clothed. He was wearing a suit, and he and Maud were shopping. Meanwhile, his followers are just in a cave. Now, unbeknownst to Crefield, George Mitchell, the brother of Donna and Esther Mitchell, he had been seething with rage over this whole situation for months. The disgusting things that he had done to his sisters, the fact that he continued to lure his sisters away, it was just all too much for George to handle, and he finally snapped. The people who knew George around this time described him as crazy as a loon, and he was telling the families of the cult members that he was going to kill Crefield. He did not try to hide it like Lewis did. He was openly telling everyone that he was going to track Crefield down and kill him. And George did manage to pinpoint Crefield's location. He knew that he was in Seattle, and Crefield had no clue that he was being hunted and that George Mitchell was in Seattle stalking him at the time, waiting for the right moment to pounce. And then on May 7th, 1906, as Crefield and Maude were walking down the sidewalk in Seattle, George finally made his move. As they were walking past a pharmacy, they did not realize that they had just passed by an armed George Mitchell. George had turned his back to the couple as they walked by so they wouldn't see him. And then as they passed him, George turned around, he pulled out his gun, and he fired a bullet right into the back of Crefield's head, killing him instantly. Now, Maude, of course, completely freaks out. She is screaming, and people are starting to gather around to see what was happening. And George Mitchell was like eerily calm. He didn't run. He just sat down on the sidewalk and smoked a cigar and waited for the police to take him into custody. And when they were questioning George about the murder, he said, "Well, I shot the man for ruining my two sisters. That's all there is to it. I am, of course, sorry that I've been called upon to take any man's life, but there is no one among you who can appreciate my feelings. No brother could love his sisters any more than I. They were good Christian girls until this man came along. They believed in him and thought he was a godly man. I guess they believe in him yet, in spite of the fact that he has ruined them and disgraced the rest of us. I tried to make them see it like we and everybody else saw it, but it was no use as long as he was around. Well, he ain't around now." And so many people donated money to George's defense. They ended up raising like $30,000 for his bail and his defense fees because no one wanted to see him sent to jail for this, because most people believed that this murder was completely justified. In fact, potential jurors were being threatened by family and friends that if they were to be selected to be on the jury and they did not acquit George, they should be tarred and feathered. Several people testified at this trial, but the most compelling witness was O.V. Hurt. This man seemed like just a really good person. He loved his family so much, and the jury could see that he was a total wreck because of everything. He was fighting back tears during most of his testimony, and especially when he was talking about his wife Sarah, because she still hadn't fully recovered mentally from everything that she had been through with Crefield. And after only an hour and a half of deliberations, the jury came back with a verdict of not guilty. And the people were so happy and relieved about this verdict. They truly felt like George was totally justified, and it was really a great day for the people involved in the case, except for the people who were still loyal to Crefield. Maude was convinced that Crefield was going to, rise from the dead, and so she was spending a lot of her time at the cemetery waiting for any sign of disturbance in the ground. And remember the people that Crefield had left in that cave? Well, they were in there for nearly a month. They had been surviving on like clams and crabs that had washed up on the shore. And then one day, a man was out on his boat and he spotted these women. They looked terrible. They were emaciated. They were half dressed. They were filthy. And they had a 5-month-old baby out there with them. I have no clue how they managed to survive. And so the man pulls his boat up and he's like, "What are you doing out here?" And they told him that they were waiting for their leader, Crefield, to guide them to the New Eden. And this man, of course, knew who Crefield was. Everybody knew who Crefield was. And he realized that these were the holy rollers. These were the brides of Christ. And they obviously had no clue that their leader had been murdered. And when he tried to tell them that Crefield was dead, they didn't believe him at first. The followers refused to get on his boat so that he could get them to safety because they weren't about to disobey their leader. So the guy gave them all the food that he had on his boat and he left, and he contacted O.V. Hurt to let him know that he had just found the missing followers. Someone went out there and eventually they were able to talk the followers into leaving, but it took a lot of convincing. That cave is now referred to as Preacher's Cave because of this case. And now these followers had to come to terms with the fact that their leader was actually dead, and they did not take the news well. But the person who took this the hardest was Esther Mitchell, George Mitchell's sister, the sister that he had killed Crefield in order to protect. Just a few days after the acquittal, as George was getting ready to board a train to Seattle, Esther showed up at the train station to say goodbye. And George was really relieved that she had come to say goodbye because he knew that she had not forgiven him for what he had done. But he took her being there as a good sign that they were, moving in the right direction and that maybe one day she could truly forgive him. So they say their goodbyes, and as George turns to board the train, Esther pulls out a gun and shoots him in the head, killing him instantly. She has just shot her brother in the same way that her brother shot Crefield. And she reacted the same way George had reacted. She just calmly sat down and she waited for the police to arrive. It sounds like something out of a movie. During questioning, it came out that Maud Hurt had conspired with Esther to kill George, and so she was also taken into custody. O.V. Hurt, being the super devoted father that he was, he mortgaged his home to get the money for a defense lawyer for Maud, and O.V. wrote Maud a letter around this time, and it's so sad. He said, "My heart is broken about this, and after all, I love you more than I ever did. You're my daughter, and nothing, as I told you at the depot, could drive me away from you, but I cannot realize that my sweet Maud would have ever allowed herself to do such a rash act." Maud and Esther were both found to be insane, and they were both supposed to be sent to a psychiatric hospital in Oregon. But before that could happen, on November 17th, 1906, a blood-curdling scream was heard coming from Maud Hurt's jail cell. When guards arrived, she was convulsing and she had bitten through her tongue and she was clutching her heart, and she died. At first, it was thought that she had died of a heart attack, but after an autopsy, it was determined that she had poisoned herself with strychnine. It's believed that someone had smuggled the poison into her. Esther Mitchell was eventually sent to a psychiatric hospital for a few years. O.V. Hurt ended up buying some property near the area where Crefield had planned to build the new Eden, and many of the people involved in the cult, they ended up moving to the area as well. Sarah Hurt eventually did recover from the whole ordeal, and she and O.V. put their relationship back together. Many of the members did go on to live mostly normal, successful lives, but Esther Mitchell was still harboring a lot of demons from her past, and a few years after she was released from the psychiatric hospital, she took her own life the same way Maud had. She poisoned herself with strychnine. She was only 26 years old. And that was the crazy story of how a complete stranger strolled into a small farming community and completely destroyed the lives of dozens of people. Let me know what you guys think about this one. What's your opinion on George Mitchell's verdict? Do you think that he should have served some time? Do you think that he should have been sentenced to death? Don't forget, you can check out Manacora honey by clicking the link in the description box. This honey is so delicious and full of good stuff. I cannot recommend it enough. If you found this video interesting, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and leaving me a comment. That is the easiest way for you to support me and my channel. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.